Hey guys, what is going on? Chris here with Shughead Gaming, bringing you my review for Scraper First Strike, developed by Labrodex Inc., and is currently available on Index, Vive, Rift, PSVR, and Windows Mixed Reality. This review will of course be on the PSVR version and reviewed on a PS4 Pro. Scraper First Strike released July 4th for an estimated price of $20. Of course, that depends on your region. In Scraper First Strike, the player takes on the role of Casey Maxwell, a modified hover pod pilot, and a member of the Human Resistance Force. Your mission is to help the HRF take back Reactor Building 3, restore power to the secret military base, and drive back the Humech robots that have seized New Austin. Modify your weapons, engineer new parts for your pod, and barter for consumables that will help you on your journey. This combination of iRobot meets Die Hard sounds like VR heaven, but does Labrodex pull off this ambitious effort? Let's find out. As always guys, if you like this video, please hit that like button, and if you'd like to see more PSVR content from me, please consider subscribing, and for video updates, hit that bell icon. As always, graphics are up first. Starting on the top deck of a giant skyscraper, players' first glimpse at the world created by Labrodex is that of a wide-open military-occupied rooftop, complete with a view of the city around and the endless vista of the skyline beyond. Impressive to be sure, but also a very good indicator of the graphical limitations at play here in the PSVR port. Draw distance is pretty decent, but is marred slightly by some aliasing issues that creep up when looking at certain set pieces from a moderate amount of distance. This becomes much less of an issue once the game heads inside, as the interior levels do sharpen up significantly in the headset due to the reduced view distance. Thankfully though, the game succeeds in avoiding any overuse of anti-aliasing that often results in blurry and muddy looking textures. The hoverpod, your main method of transportation, is modeled nicely if not just a bit uninspired, but it does a nice job of really giving you the sense of presence in the world and offering a sense of the power of being inside a mini tank. Character animations specifically from the human teammates you interact with are serviceable at best, and while they aren't horrible, they certainly don't offer anything to brag about either, often coming off quite wooden in their appearance and ability to emote, reminding me of some of the NPCs we would have come across in Skyrim. Design and animation of the various robot varieties you will encounter are again very serviceable, but also nothing you haven't seen before. Being robots, the less than fluid movement animations are much more forgivable here, but they lack presence and rarely feel intimidating or threatening. In fact, Scraper First Strike's biggest issue is that the whole game just feels a little generic and bland. Regardless of what area you are in, the entire game is brought down by a sense of sameness across all facets of its design, whether it being architecture, texture designs, color palette, or simply level design. The blandness is somewhat livened up by the lighting and particle effects on display here, giving the firefights and certain aspects of the environment some extra visual flair, but even that seems to have been scaled down somewhat for the port to PSVR. The thing is, I know I sound negative on visuals, but honestly, the game as a whole is actually quite polished and in fact often trumps many of its peers on PSVR. And this brings me back to my original point. It at times feels like Labrodex is trying as hard as possible to hit above its weight class, attempting to offer an incredibly ambitious game world and playing experience. Unfortunately, this also makes it easier to compare the game to larger titles in the flat world, often making Scraper First Strike feel more like a lost gem from the PS2 era, now brought into VR. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as the game does indeed have a bit of a retro charm, but it does keep it from hitting the heights I think the team was hoping for. Sound is up next.
Humanoid presence detected.
Labrodex, again in the sound department, like in the visual, pushes to deliver something far greater than one would expect from such a small development team. Looking first at the game music, Labrodex employed famed and critically acclaimed video game composer Winifred Phillips, composer of such game series as God of War, Little Big Planet, and Assassin's Creed. Her contribution to the game's sound package brings a soundtrack that, while maybe not among her best, certainly gives the world of Scraper a sense of presence and quality we don't often see in smaller titles such as this. I would have liked to hear a few more tracks to add some more variety, but what is here is nicely done. Voice acting, on the other hand, is only serviceable at best. Nothing here is cringeworthy or cheesy, but the delivery almost always sounded like recorded sound bites and less of a real person talking to me. Weapon and world sounds fare a bit better, offering a nice selection of powerful weapon effects, system warnings, and robot attack sounds. Unfortunately, the game is often void of much in the way of ambient environmental sounds, often leaving the world feeling as bland and lifeless as the visuals. The music does help a bit here, but again, repetition comes into play. Taken as a whole, Scraper First Strike really doesn't do anything wrong in the sound department, it's just that it often felt underwhelming and anemic for a game of this scope, never really delivering the level of excitement it could have. And that brings us to gameplay. Time and time again, I hear people complaining that we don't get much in the way of depth in the made-for-VR games that are often put out. VR is expensive to make for, and with a significantly smaller player base to that of traditional gaming, also a rather risky endeavor. For this reason alone, I applaud Labrodex for, even as a small team with limited resources, they have strived to deliver a VR shooter with more substance. The story of Scraper First Strike follows the tried and true sci-fi narrative of self-aware AI deciding to protect mankind from itself by wiping it out. Although in a very welcome change, Scraper First Strike's story springboards off an original prequel novel, Scraper: Rise of Cypher, written by New York Times best-selling author Ryder Wyndham, to craft the game's lore and backstory. In fact, you can actually read the entire novel inside the game for those wanting more narrative to your shooting. Unfortunately, when it comes to the actual game itself, it leaves much of the narrative to the novel and instead chooses to deliver on what is essentially an objective-based wave shooter with a distinct focus on RPG elements. In this 4-hour campaign, you and your armed bumper car will descend 6 separate floors fulfilling simple mission objectives while shooting anything in your way. Downed enemies will drop various resources and pieces of tech, for which you can collect and use at either a maintenance machine to repair your pod or a fabricator to create consumables like ammo, hacking tools, or shield repairs. Exploration and mission progression will also reward you with schematics that allow you to create new weapons, as well as upgrade mods that can be applied to everything from weapons and shields to speed boosts and energy recharge rates. As for the pod itself, it houses up to 6 weapons of which you can choose to equip to either side of the pod and controlled by each of your hands. Other abilities like a speed boost, a special attack, or an EMP blast can all be utilized during combat and consume energy to recharge. The RPG elements in play here were easily my favorite aspect of playing Scraper, as they added a real sense of progression and added a real sense of purpose to all the shooting and exploration. Unfortunately, it is hindered significantly by a confusing and cumbersome crafting and menu system that made the whole process a complete pain to figure out and implement. And speaking of confusing, this brings me to my other huge issue with Scraper First Strike: the way in which it, or rather, doesn't communicate to the player about what to do. Objectives are given over the radio, but never able to see or hear again. Arrows on your radar might help point you in the right direction until they don't. This often left me aimlessly driving around levels and changing floors just to stumble across what the game wanted from me, and in the process significantly trying my patience. And unfortunately so, as the whole game loop of taking out various enemies, taking on boss fights, completing objectives, and upgrading my abilities is one I actually enjoyed a lot. AI of enemies, although not incredibly intelligent, still made for difficult and often intense firefights, requiring me to actually think about weapon loadout, ammo conservation, shield strength, pod health, and resource management, all while on the run. Control schemes themselves were also a mixed bag, weapon switching being done by 2 separate weapon wheels, each controlling one hand, but controlled all on one controller, made weapon changing a chore and not nearly as quick and intuitive as it could have been. Using just 2 move controllers continued this trend, making strafing, turning, boosting, and firing a cumbersome affair, especially when you add in weapon switching on top of actually interacting with some controls in the pod by grabbing and pulling them in-game. The inclusion of DS4 and aim support helped alleviate some of these issues, but unfortunately created a real disconnect and breaking immersion, with now only allowing you to control one weapon independently and removing the ability to interact in-game with the pod controls. Thankfully, Scraper First Strike includes 3D rudder support, allowing all movement controls to be placed at my feet and freeing up my hands to handle all weapons and pod systems, easily making this my control method of choice if you have the means. The added immersion of actually sitting in the game also made it so sitting and using the 3D rudder felt appropriate and immersive. Tracking was spot on across all devices, and a robust set of sensitivity settings are thankfully provided to cater the experience to the user, including a suite of comfort options. Scraper First Strike can be played seated or standing, with sitting being recommended for greatest immersion. A moderate amount of room is also recommended. And finally, that brings us to fun factor, my final review. If I had to describe Scraper First Strike in one word, it would be ambitious. It is very obvious that Labrodex really wanted to create a game that was a significant step up from what is currently the VR norm. In many cases, they have, but reaching for the stars with limited resources also meant they often fell short of what they were likely going for. In my first few hours, I was legitimately impressed with Scraper and having a lot of fun. Unfortunately, as frustration and monotony set in, the game did unfortunately lose some of its luster by the end, leaving me little reason to return once I had completed the 4-hour campaign. As you know, I hate number ratings and instead rate games on a basis of buy, wait for a sale, or burn it to the ground. At $20, this is definitely priced right and easily offers enough value and quality to justify buying it at this price. It's not without its issues, but it still remains a significant step up from the average VR shooter. Being the first in a planned 5-chapter saga, I look forward to what Labrodex will attempt next. As always guys, if you like this video, please hit that like button, and if you'd like to see more PSVR content from me, please consider subscribing, and for video updates, hit that bell icon. I will catch you guys on my next video.